So then, Mark chapter 15, verses 1 through 15. And as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." And the chief priests accused him of many things. And Pilate again asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you?" But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. Now at the feast, he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, "Then what shall I do with the man you call the king of the Jews?" And they cried out again, "Crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas. And having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Okay, we're really approaching the cross here, aren't we? We see getting nearer and nearer to what we know is a culmination, not the culmination, because there's more to come beyond the cross, but a culmination of what we've seen happening recently. Last week, John Pendray spoke, and he showed the difference between how Jesus handled a trial and how well Jesus handled that trial, and how Peter handled a trial of sorts and didn't handle it well. And here today, we're seeing Jesus facing another trial where the stakes are even higher. Do you think life's like that, isn't it? You can face a trial, you get through one trial, only to face another trial. And it seems worse than the last one. But again, we're going to see in Jesus an example of how to face trial. And actually, weirdly, we're also going to see Pilate undergoing a trial of sorts as well. Weirdly, even though he is the one on the face who's doing the trying, he himself, in a way, is under trial here as well. We'll see how he responds to that. So, starting in verse 1 there, and as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. So, why were they consulting? Obviously, they'd tried Jesus themselves and come to their own conclusions. What was the consultation about that they were having here? Well, presumably the consultation was, all right, we know that we found him guilty. How do we get a death sentence against him? How do we do that? Because you'll recall from last week, looking at Mark chapter 14, that their finding against Jesus in their trial was that he was guilty of blasphemy. In fact, just reading back, I don't have it to put up on the screen here, but from Mark chapter 14, in verse 61, you recall, we read, "Again, the high priest asked him, 'Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?' And Jesus said, 'I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven.' And the high priest tore his garments and said, 'What further witnesses do we need? You've heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?' And they all condemned him as deserving death." So that was the conclusion of their trial, that he was worthy of death. Why? Because as far as they were concerned, he had committed blasphemy in what he had actually said. And according to their law, that was punishable by death. We see not going to turn to it for now, but even back in Leviticus chapter 24, verse 16, speaks there of one who blasphemes being worthy of death by stoning. The problem was they were under Jewish rule. They were under Roman rule, and only a Roman court could order the death sentence. They didn't have the right themselves to condemn anyone to death. So that's what the consultation would have been about. How do we actually get this death sentence against him? Because the problem is we bring him to Rome, we bring him to the authorities, we're going to tell them that he's guilty of blasphemy, but they're going to say, so what? They don't care whether Jesus would have blasphemed according to Jewish belief. So they've got to find another way. And what is the other way? What is the solution? Actually, they will have concluded to accuse him not of blasphemy, but of treason, basically, bringing him and saying he is purporting to be a king. And in purporting to be a king, then that is a treasonous thing to say. It's in opposition to Caesar as king. It's in opposition to Rome as the ruler. So that would be their solution to this. In fact, in John's account of this, John's Gospel, chapter 18, we see it's made plain, actually. John gives us a bit more detail than Mark gives us. We see in John chapter 18, verse 31, Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." But the Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." Basically saying, Pilate saying, you do what you want. They say, we can't do what we want, because what we want is to kill him. And you won't let us do that. That's why we're coming to you, for you to do that. So that's what's happening here. And they're coming to Pilate. Who is Pilate? Pontius Pilate, basically, who was the Roman governor of Judea at the time, a magistrate, basically, with the legal power and authority to condemn someone to death. So basically, that's why they have to come to him. Pilate apparently was not resident in Jerusalem all the time, but he would be in Jerusalem at this time because it was the feast. It was an important time in the Jewish calendar, important time for Jerusalem. It was the Feast of Passover. So he would be there. So good timing for them as the Jewish leaders, as the religious leaders. What do we know about Pilate? Well, obviously we know stuff from the Bible, and we also know some things from sources outside the Bible, from historians. We know something of his career. We know something of him as a person as well. He doesn't have a particularly good reputation. Doesn't have a good reputation either in the role that he had here. Also, that as a person, his reputation was being fairly heartless, insensitive to what other people wanted, pretty cruel as well in the way he dealt with things. Certainly, he did not have a good relationship with the Jewish people. He didn't like them. They didn't like him. And so, not very many popularity votes for him. We see then, in verse 2, Pilate asks Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered him, "You have said so." So this is the main charge on the basis of which Jesus has been brought before Pilate, that he is king of the Jews. That's the charge of treason. And apparently, I've read the way this is phrased in the original Greek, Pilate's question is somewhat incredulous. Like, are you the king of the Jews? Probably had an expectation knowing that somebody was being brought to him who was claiming to be in opposition to Caesar. And Pilate would immediately see Jesus and think, okay, you don't look like I was expecting somebody to look. You don't look like somebody who's a king, or somebody who's purporting to be a king, or somebody who's choosing to come against Caesar. You would probably be expecting someone who was looking somewhat aggressive, somewhat militant. So Pilate asks his question. And Jesus' response, "You have said so." Interesting response there. It's neither an admission nor a denial. Really, he's just saying, you have said so. Because, of course, Jesus knows that he is the king of the Jews. He's the king of everyone. But he also knows not in the way that Pilate means it. So he's putting it back on Pilate. Mark, one thing we know about Mark's gospel is it's so short, and Mark doesn't always give us a lot of detail. Sometimes we have to look to other gospel accounts to get more of the detail that's going on. Interestingly, there are certain parts, as we've seen already in Mark's gospel, where he gives us details that other people don't. But certainly when it comes to this interaction with Pilate, we could look at other gospel accounts to fill in more of what was actually going on. And we could look, again, in John's gospel, John chapter 18, from verse 33, where we see how John renders more in this account. It says, so Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus answered, do you say this of your own accord? Or did others say it to you about me? Interesting that Jesus puts this to him. It really reminded me when I was reading that of, what we see even in, again, the gospel accounts, different with Matthew, Mark, Luke, earlier on, this point where Jesus has said to his own disciples, who do people say that I am? And they come back in, well, some say this, some say this, some say this. And then in the end, Jesus says, but what about you? Who do you say that I am? And Peter's response is, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. A revelation from heaven. Again, Jesus is always asking us, who do you say that I am? The issue is not just, what have other people told you that I am? Who have other people told you that I am? What's your revelation? Who do you say that I am? We can be in church life and going along just with what other people have told us. But the issue is not just going along with what other people have told us. The issue is, what have we seen of Jesus? Who do we know of who he actually is? How have we actually responded? Jesus presses the question, who do you say I am? Sometimes, actually, Jesus will allow us, I'm running ahead a little bit, but he will allow us to face trials so that we have to come to terms with who we really believe Jesus to be. Is he the king? Is he really the king in the midst of all of this? Is he really the king in the midst of this challenge? Is he the king in the midst of this suffering? Is he the king in the midst of this uncertainty? Who do I say that he is? Because who I say that he is will determine how I am able to stand up under this challenge. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Anyway, do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me? Pilate answered, am I a Jew? It's like, why are you asking me whether I would say it of my own accord? What do I know about this stuff that you're all into? I'm not saying it on the basis of what I know. Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done? Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not of this world. Then Pilate said to him, so you are a king? And Jesus answered, you say that I'm a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. Pilate said to him, what is truth? It's kind of like, I don't think it's a sincere question there. It's probably exasperation. Like, all right, sorry, I'm just trying to get some straight answers here about everything, and you're talking about kingdom not of this world. You're asking, you're talking about the truth, listening to what is truth? Obviously, that's a question that a lot of people ask these days, what is truth? Because people don't accept absolute truth. Now, what's your truth? Oh, you tell me your truth? I'll tell you my truth. Well, I'll tell you what my truth is today. It'll be different tomorrow. It's all relative. If people were to ask you today, what is truth? You can be assured they don't want to know the answer to that question. The better question is, who is truth? We know Jesus declares, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. But is that truth that people want to hear? Often not. I mean, Pilate, what is truth? That's kind of like the last thing that we see in this account of his engagement with Jesus. He doesn't take it any further than that. He's not waiting for an answer. In fact, he basically just goes on to say in John's account, right after that, he just basically says, I find no guilt in this man. As we see Pilate saying a lot in this. Like he's listening to this, and in the end of it, it's like, what is truth? I find no guilt in this man. Like he's not coming purporting to overthrow Caesar. The things that you're charging him of, he's not guilty of that, that's clear. But back to Mark's account, perhaps because the chief priests could see that Pilate wasn't tracking with them, that it wasn't going the way they wanted it to go. It says, verse 3, and the chief priests accused him of many things. They started off with the big accusation. He says he's king. They're like, okay, this isn't flying. Okay, let's just accuse him of many things. Let's just throw as much as we can and see what actually sticks. Again, I think we all have known what that's like in one way or another. And Pilate asked him again, have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you. But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. Well, again, in Mark's account, we're not told what these other accusations are, but we can look elsewhere to a different gospel account. In this case, we can look to Luke's account in Luke chapter 23, verses 1 through 5, where it says, then the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, we found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar and saying that he himself is Christ, a king. Like, is that enough? There's 3 for a start. And Pilate asked him, are you the king of the Jews? And he answered him, you have said so. Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, I find no guilt in this man. But they were urgent, saying, okay, here's another one. He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee, even to this place. So they're saying, okay, these accusations. First of all, he's misleading the nation. He's taking the nation in a direction contrary to how you would want the nation to go. He's forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar. He's saying that he's Christ the king. Okay, yep, that one's right. He's stirring up the people. Again, this teacher was not stirring them up against Caesar. All of these things are going. I mean, just trying anything they could. In fact, blatantly not true as well when they say forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar. You remember, funnily enough, was it the last time I taught or 2 times before, when Jesus actually said in response to this question, he said, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's and render unto God that which is God's. When asked about whether or not they should pay taxes to Caesar, he actually said, yeah, it's Caesar's image on the coin. So you can give that to Caesar, but it's God's image on you. So there, render yourself. That would be really what Jesus was communicating in that. So blatantly not even true, saying, forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar. So all of these things coming forth, one accusation after another. Let's just see if anything sticks. Let's just see if anything works in order to get the result that we want. And why does it say there? Pilate was amazed. Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. Well, of course, Pilate would be used to people being brought before him, facing accusations. And what he would be used to is people actually denying accusations, trying their hardest to refute the claims that are being made against them, or alternatively admitting the claims and groveling for mercy if they had to admit it, or maybe admitting the claims proudly and making some impassioned kind of final martyr-like speech, especially if they were a rebel. You know, if I'm going down, I'm going down with these words. And yet nothing of that is coming from Jesus. And Pilate is amazed. Like, I've never encountered this. What is going on? I look at this and think, I could not be like this in this situation. We heard from John last week how he reacts when Kim makes accusations against him. Were you in the room, by the way, when that was happening? Oh, okay. You should listen to the recording. But, yeah, I think, sometimes it's not like even if I don't have an excuse, if somebody's charging me with something or other, even if I don't have an excuse, I at least have an explanation. Like, okay, let me tell you why, though, and then I think you will understand. There's something within all of us, isn't there? I think most of us anyway, who want to at least give an explanation. All right, okay, I did wrong, but let me at least explain why I did wrong. And then I think you'll be a little bit more merciful towards me, if you at least know my thinking in all of this. But he doesn't do anything. Again, John referenced this last week, but we see in Jesus the fulfillment of the prophecy from Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 53, verse 7. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. Again, this is Jesus in the face of this. Now then, going on to verse 6, which says, now at the feast, Passover, he, Pilate, used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there had been an uprising, it was just the insurrection, as if we would all know. There were lots of them around that time. But there had been one, obviously, recently, an uprising, an attempt at rebellion that it involved murder. So, among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he answered them saying, do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews? For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. You know, it's interesting here that Pilate can see right through the chief priests. He knows what's going on here. He knows what this is really about. He knows it's not about whether or not Jesus is actually a threat to Caesar. He knows it's envy, that they are recognizing that Jesus has caught the attention of people and that he is actually a challenge to them and their role. So knowing this, he's saying, all right then, you're asking me to do what I usually do. Okay, shall I release for you the King of the Jews? Probably knowing that that would be really frustrating to the chief priests if that was, in fact, what the people asked for. I wonder at this point, what is going on in Pilate's mind? Is it at this point that he actually does want to release Jesus? Or is it at this point that he's just working at the frustrating them? I think there's something of both going on. We certainly see there's a lot happening within Pilate. You might ask the question, when we see that actually, the crowd are stirred up to ask for Barabbas. I've often thought in this, and probably you have as well, this is so weird. How the crowd is this fickle that less than a week ago, they were celebrating Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Hosanna to the Son of David. And yet now, less than a week later, we have the crowd baying for his crucifixion. You think, the crowd were really that fickle that they would turn around like that? Well, should we be surprised if they were? I mean, people can turn on the slightest thing, really, especially if there was a sense of disappointment for them. If they were all hailing Jesus, because they did expect that he was the conquering king coming in. Okay, this is where it all happens. This is where Roman rule is overturned by our Messiah. this one like David, like King David. He's coming in, so let's do this. And Jesus didn't do it. Maybe you could say that already there was a disappointment setting in and a frustration and a resentment even, because they got all excited about who they thought Jesus was, what they were wanting him to do, and he didn't. So, of course, it's absolutely possible that the crowd, the same crowd, could have turned against him. That said, some commentators, as I've been reading up on this, say, you know what, this may be a different crowd altogether. Obviously, there were these people who were hailing Jesus, were hailing him as he entered into Jerusalem. But here we've got the rank and file of the Jerusalem population. It's entirely possible that the actual followers of Jesus didn't even know what was going on at this point. Everything had happened so quickly in terms of Jesus' arrest, and this trial, this previous trial by night. And now it's very early in the morning. Accounts say that the Roman workday started at dawn. So this would have been very early in the morning. The people who were there would have been people just who lived in Jerusalem. There would have been a lot of people who'd come for the Passover feast and possibly staying outside of Jerusalem and intending to come into the city later in the day, but they might not even have been there. And of course, what we do know is that the crowd there, they came up and began to ask Pilate to do what he usually did for them. Everybody in Jerusalem knew that this is what Pilate did on this day. They were just coming to have Pilate do what he normally does. They may not have even at first had Jesus in their minds. For all we know, they may have actually intentionally been coming to ask for Barabbas to be released. So, yeah, again, whichever way you look at it, perhaps it's not as surprising as you might think. What about this guy, Barabbas? We don't know anything about Barabbas outside of what we see in the gospel accounts of him, outside of what we see in Scripture. There's nothing in secular history about Barabbas. So we just know what we read here and in other accounts, the other gospel accounts. He was, as we see here in Mark's account, among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection. So he was a murderer and he was a rebel. We also see in Matthew's account, in verse 27, that he's referred to as a notorious prisoner. Notorious, well-known, famous, usually with a negative connotation, not necessarily always with a negative connotation. But he was a notorious prisoner, and we see in John's account that he was also a robber as well. Wow, seems like a thoroughly disreputable character. And yet, let's bear in mind that, he had been part of an insurrection, an uprising against Rome. So that will have given him some popularity with the people, the fact that he tried to overthrow Rome. Murderer, presumably murdering Romans, one would assume. And a robber, maybe robbing Romans or the wealthy. Who knows? May have been some sort of almost Robin Hood type character. We don't know. I mean, I'm not going to paint him well because the overriding image seems to be negative. But maybe it wasn't that hard for the crowd to be persuaded to ask for Barabbas. Maybe, like I say, that had been their intention in gathering in the first place, not even knowing that Jesus was under trial. We just don't know. What we do know is that, as it says, verse 11, the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. Verse 12, and Pilate again said to them, then what shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews? And they cried out again, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, why? What evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, crucify him. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas. And having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. We obviously don't know what was going on in Pilate's mind in the midst of all of this. As we've already heard, as we've already seen, he said on several occasions, I find no guilt in this man. He's done nothing wrong. So Pilate sees this. In fact, in John's account, John chapter 19, verse 12, it actually says that at one point, well, from a point onwards, Pilate actually sought to release Jesus. So he was moved in this way. Again, this is extraordinary, really, when you bear in mind what we do know from historical accounts of the type of guy that Pilate was. He's not a guy who's sympathetic. Yeah. He's not a guy who's compassionate. He's not a guy who's particularly just. Why would he even seek to release Jesus? Is it that there's something in his encounter with Jesus that's confronting him, that's challenging him? We also have the very interesting reference in Matthew's gospel, in Matthew chapter 27, verse 19, to Pilate's wife, where it says, while he, Pilate, was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream. Like, what is going on there? Pilate's wife having a dream, suffering as a result of it, knowing he's the righteous man, sending word to her husband saying, have nothing to do with him. What's the conflict that's going on in Pilate? We can only imagine. I know he's innocent. I know this is just out of envy from the religious leaders. I've got this thing from my wife coming to me as well. What am I to do in this situation? How does Pilate respond in the midst of this? Well, ultimately he gives in. That's the tragedy in all of this. Well, tragedy, except obviously in the sovereignty of God, we knew this had to happen and we're thankful that it did. But, where would we be if he had in fact given in? But just in terms of his personal conflict, it's pretty extraordinary. It says that he gives in to satisfy the crowd. Again, we can look to a different gospel account to fill out some more of the details of that. Matthew's account, Matthew chapter 27, verse 24, which says, when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves. And all the people answered, his blood be on us and on our children. Wow. Yeah. I mean, yeah, we'll take it. We don't care. Yeah, blame us. Let his blood be on us. We don't even care. The things that people will say. Have you ever encountered this? Sometimes people say, I don't care. Even if I do go to hell, I don't even care. Wow. People don't know what they say a lot of the time. Of course, in Pilate saying, I'm innocent of this man's blood. Well, I'm sorry. No, you're not. You can't, again, people will try and abdicate responsibility in situations. Say, well, no, you do it. It's not on me, it's on you. No, the very fact that you're saying you do it, it's on you. So you can't step away from it. But I just find, I've been thinking a lot as I've been preparing, just what was happening here. I think that it seems to me that there was something where he was confronted with the truth. Even if he said, what is truth? He had truth standing right in front of him. And I think he was confronted by this truth and convicted by this truth, softened, and on some level responding to this truth, only then to pull back and harden. Again, because thinking, wait, what are the consequences of this? What's the cost for me? What is the cost for me in doing this? No, I'm not going to have that. I'm not going to have the consequences of accepting Jesus for who he is. I'm not going to do that. Honestly, I've tragically seen this happen in people's lives. Sharing the gospel with people, and you see that they're being stirred. You see that they're being convicted. You see that they're being drawn. They recognize this is true. This is true. They're on the verge of responding. And then suddenly they pull back. Nope. I'm not going to live with the consequences of that. That would cost me too much. To give my life to Jesus would cost me too much. I want things the way I want them. It's too much to give up. It's too much to surrender. I won't do it. And again, even more tragic, I've seen people really harden after that. Not just pull away, not just resist, but then actually become very aggressively, against what they so nearly were drawn into. We might have experienced something of that ourselves. Even maybe those of us who've already given our lives to the Lord, we know that he's our Savior. We know, we would say that he's the Lord, but he calls us to certain things. And we get drawn, thinking, I think God is speaking to me. I think he's asking me to do this. Do I obey him? I think I will. No, I'm not going to. It costs too much. I won't speak up in this situation. I won't act in this way. I won't give this up. I won't do this. And we become hardened then because of our rejection of the word that's coming to us. Please, God, don't let it be for us. And again, the hardness that comes in him is evidenced in the fact that he condemns Jesus to crucifixion. Yes, obviously that's what they were asking for. But seriously, we're probably talking weeks to come more about this. Such an extremely cruel and shameful way, to be executed. It's intended for rebellious slaves and for insurrectionists. The very things that Pilate knew Jesus wasn't. He knew Jesus wasn't deserving of this, wasn't deserving of anything, but certainly wasn't deserving of this. Yet nevertheless, that was what he was willing to give. And not just that he be scourged ahead of time. Again, thankfully not the time to go into this in much detail because I wouldn't really want to, but many of you would know scourging, this horrible whipping, beating with leather straps that are embedded with pieces of metal and fragments of bone. Just torturous in and of itself. People would die just from scourging, let alone from crucifixion. So to condemn Jesus to crucifixion, and then also to say, and scourging before that as well. It's kind of what a reaction, how extreme. Just coming back again to the people saying his blood be on us and on our children. You know what? Even though it's, again, a shameful and ignorant thing to say when people would go that far and say, we don't even care what the consequences of this are. Just do it. And yet also, as I read this, I thought, ironically, yes, his blood would be on you. Not even in the way you're meaning it. Even as we sung about this morning, his blood. Little would you know that actually his blood would be on you if you return to him. His blood would cover you, actually. His blood was being shed for you. And to think, thank God, that so many in this crowd baying for that crucifixion, no doubt would ultimately know the benefit of his blood on them, his blood covering them, as indeed it covers all of us who place our faith in that saving work on the cross. It is ironic, again, just as we draw to a close in this, that Jesus, therefore, actually dies then and there in the place of Barabbas. Barabbas, one who was clearly guilty, and Jesus, who was clearly innocent, dies in the place. It's kind of the first fruit almost, isn't it? Symbolic of what he would do for all of us. Yeah. Dying as one who is innocent for those who are guilty, us. In fact, I saw one commentator speculate and say, we know Jesus may actually have been hung on the cross, which had been intended for Barabbas. It had been prepared for him. He was the man condemned to die. Suddenly, Jesus comes as a substitute. And on the very cross, perhaps intended for Barabbas, Jesus, the innocent one, is hung. Really, but it's for all of us, isn't it? Again, that is, he personifies Barabbas in this moment, personifies what Jesus has done for all of us. Jesus, the innocent one, hanging on that cross, or condemned to that cross for us, the guilty ones. A further irony, by the way, that even as I was preparing this, I didn't realize up until this point, but Barabbas, that name, actually means son of the Father. Because Bar, that B-A-R, that's Jewish, meaning son of, and Abba, Abba Father, Barabbas. How ironic that this man named son of the Father is set free in order that we might all know sonship. We might all be embraced as sons of the Father through this. It's amazing how this all ties in. So just in this, I struggled as I prepared for this because I kind of think, what's the application for us in all of this? It was some easy 3 points. This is what you can go away and do after today. That's what I would love to do. But I can't do that. But the reality is that this is sobering stuff for us. Of course, we will go from this into seeing what happens next. But Jesus, just what an example to us. Again, I was just so sobered. Even as we sung the words this morning, Jesus dying on the cross, even but thinking, putting myself, well, I can't put myself, but thinking Jesus, knowing what was ahead of him and yet still remaining silent. Like a sheep before its shearers, like a lamb being led to slaughter. Jesus, that you would do this. Even perhaps with still conflict within, as we'd heard him say previously, if there's any way other, when you're thinking, Jesus saying, I could do anything, I could be free right now. Not just by saying certain things, but by doing certain things. Calling angel armies to my aid, but I won't, even though I know what I'm facing. Reminded of the verse, which for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, even enduring this trial. We should be sobered by this and how we respond now for Jesus, how we live our lives for Jesus. Again, seeing the bad example of Pilate, how we respond when we see the truth of who Jesus is. Will we, at cost of everything, make the right choice, do the right thing? God, help us, please. Help us. Thank you, Jesus, for enduring this, even before the cross, enduring this for us, that your resolve, your determination to give yourself for us, that your blood might be shed, that it might be upon us and might cleanse us. Thank you, Jesus. Amen. Have a great day.